Alrighty, hi everyone. I would like to introduce you to a highly intelligent and beautiful woman inside and out. Dr. Patricia Miller has over 25 years of experience in the mental health industry, specializing in a wide range of topics, including interpersonal violence, community action research, diversity issues, addictions, PTSD, and so much more. Being duly registered as a social worker and a registered psychologist in the province of Alberta and the province of British Columbia, Dr. Miller continues to advance her education, currently working on finishing a clinical psychology degree through Cal Southern University. With all of her achievements, she is also a professor at Mount Royal University for over 15 years and is the director of Research and Clinical Development at the Calgary Therapy Institute. Welcome, Dr. Miller, and thank you so much for jumping on board with this mini-series of mine where I hope to share valuable information to people of all walks of life. So today's topic is traumatology, the many faces of trauma. And Dr. Miller, we're going to start with, what is your definition of trauma and how does it affect individuals differently?
Great. Well, firstly, I want to say thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for giving me a space to bring information that I've gleaned over the years through education, working with people, talking with people, sharing, very safe, positive spaces with colleagues and people that were seeking help. And so part of my, capacity today is built off of, many incredible people that I've worked with, worked on behalf of, and also have had the opportunity to have great education. So I want to thank you for this space. So what is my definition of trauma? Well, that's a big question, and I know we only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to try and find smaller ways to talk about this. I think the number one thing I would say is that trauma is the lived experience around a traumatic impact that people have experienced in their lives. So if we think about traumatic experiences, even within our own city and our province, we can think about natural disasters like the floods. We could think about car accidents that happen every day. We could also know that interpersonal violence is real in many people's lives. Statistically speaking, we know, even sitting in a university like Mount Royal University, and some of the research that Dr. Gay Worth has done, that about 30 to 35% of university students will experience some sort of sexual assault and also physical assault while they are a student at a university. That's only not just here, but across Canada. Those are alarming statistics, of course, when you think 1 of 3 students would experience some sort of traumatic impact related to interpersonal violence. Excuse me. We also know that traumatic experiences can include health crisis. If you look at the impact of COVID-19, for many people, they lost someone, or they ended up in a very serious medical crisis, or they became very estranged from people or were quite isolated, which can be quite traumatic for people that are already facing many barriers. So when you think about trauma, and trauma being the lived experience around the impact of a traumatic experience, it's really what the person or people go through. And so the definition around trauma really comes from the person or the community of people that are going through the impact. And one of the things we've really come to understand, it's important that the people living with the experience can be a part of naming what is trauma. Because what is trauma to one person that might have the privilege of a home and an education, they may not feel the same impact of, let's say, the floods in relation to another person that really has been struggling to find a home and doesn't have food security and maybe is more at risk to be harmed by the impact of a natural disaster. And that research is actually coming through. So when you think about the definition of trauma, it's the impact as defined by the person or people that have been impacted by the traumatic experience. And there's definitely some clear emotional burden, there can be physical burden, psychological burden in relation to living within trauma and living with trauma. So what that means, if you don't mind me, I'm going to keep talking,
Yeah,
and
please,
you just let me know if I need to shift
No,
gears.
no.
When you think about some of the symptoms or some of the things we might see around the burden that people live with, if it's severe enough, there may actually be a psychological diagnosis. That's where around mental health you will see diagnoses around post-traumatic stress disorder, which is really when an impact is so great that that person keeps re-experiencing the event throughout their daily lives, and it can come up in dreams, it can come up in panic attacks, they may dissociate, you can't think in the same way, you don't sleep, you don't eat, and sometimes you don't feel that the world is safe in the way that you knew it to be safe. There can also be conditions such as anxiety that increases, panic disorder, depression, and sometimes for people they're barely coping, and so addictions will also become a way of trying to cope with a very difficult situation. For other people, it may be more that they no longer trust things in the same way they did before. So if you're living with trauma, you may find that, let's say something traumatic happened on the road and you were in some sort of car accident, you no longer want to drive, you want to drive only at certain times, you become very panicked just to drive from A to B. So you see that physiology, right, where the body is responding in a stress type response, even though you're currently safe. And then the emotional burden is quite significant. I mean, people live with deep despair in relation to living with trauma. They tend to, or they could, isolate a lot because they sometimes feel ashamed. And shame is the process of what's wrong with me? Why can't I get through this? Why am I, burdened in this way and that person isn't? And they might also internalize what was wrong with me that I, couldn't cope or stop or do something in relation to whatever happened. And that in turn, of course, is quite a psychological concern for people when you live in a chronic state of shame. You don't feel worthy. Usually you disengage your relationships, and yet relationships and healthy relationships and support is key to some of the healing around trauma. But when you're in the trauma experience, a lot of times you're disconnecting because you're very burdened. And so people will become very isolated as they live with trauma. The other thing we see around trauma is that people may not follow through on things such as education. Students may not feel like they can come to class. They're too overwhelmed, too burdened, too afraid to talk about it. They feel ashamed, so they don't necessarily show up for some of the things they normally would. And we know that under education also sits alongside traumatic experiences and living with trauma, underemployment, because a person doesn't feel like they can get up, face the world, think through things, so then they may not be able to attend to work that they're supposed to, and then also just their relationships with people in the community, things that they used to volunteer with, participate in, they no longer feel capable to do that.
Oh, that's so much information, and it's amazing. And it's like, for me, I'm curious what, from an individual that is experiencing trauma to their loved ones and close by community, to then society, each tier, each level, like what can we do to be able to support or create a safe psychological space for people to move through trauma and be able to properly heal, to be able to kind of really grow and move forward in life and have a positive impact?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you're framing in a couple different areas of discussion. So post-traumatic growth is the possibility, right, of coming through this traumatic experience and its impact, and looking at what are ways that I can grow with the support of others. Because what the research tells us is that around the impact, we need support, we need community, we need someone to reach out and ask us what happened to you, right? Not why didn't you go to work, or why aren't you showing up for class, or why aren't you doing this, or why were you doing that? We need people to ask those safe questions. What happened to you? We're here to support you. We're here to validate you. So support becomes key, and that's individual, it's community, it's educational institutions that have a lot of opportunity to reach into the student community and offer out resources, education of where people can go to get help. numbers, online support is becoming quite a key component in relation to mental health and trauma. And you're seeing 24 hours that people can, call into something like the distress center and talk to another person that's there to hear them, and then to offer out some of the other great resources we have in the community. What we also know is that trauma focused care is really important. One of the things that happens for people around a traumatic experience is a lot of times they lose the choice to be safe, the choice to have control over their body, their life, right, their soul sometimes. So really, when you think of trauma-focused care, it is about offering people support and choice. I'm here to understand you. I'm here to offer ideas and different resources, and I want you to be able to choose, to have the knowledge to know that whatever has happened, you're not alone in it. And these are some of the resources we have in the city. And I mean, Calgary has a lot of vitality, it has a lot of energy, and you have a lot of really committed, strong people looking to create good supports for all people. And we really have to look at barrier-free support, because when you have been impacted by a traumatic experience, the last thing you may be thinking about or able to think about is to, where my income or how my income might be able to cover off some of the expenses. You're barely getting through. You may not. You may have lost your income source, whatever that is, or you're so helpless, hopeless. We need to have resources that are barrier-free. They're there. You can pick up a phone, you can find a person, or wherever you go to receive resources, it's non-judgmental, it's safe, and people are willing to try, and it's almost like put in a team, a circle of care that will help someone through this very difficult time, or help this family or community through this very difficult time.
Mm-hmm. So with current research, what is your industry in trauma and your understanding with, everything that has happened from childhood to all these other developmental years and milestones? What are some of the key things that are coming out of studies now?
Well, I think what we're seeing a lot of is prevalence, how much prevalence there is across the lifespan of traumatic experience. I mean, if you think of the Canadian government is looking at it through public health, they are statistically speaking, or it's statistically saying that 1 out of 3 young people before the age of 15 is impacted by some sort of interpersonal violence. So physical is first, witnessing interpersonal violence in the home is second, and sexual abuse is third. That's not even considering the impact of psychological, which is emotional and mental abuse that young people might be going through, and that's in the home, and that's just those that talked about it. We have certain population groups, if you look at intersectionality, that are facing racism, classism, ableism, anything to do with gender orientation is in there as well. The intersectionality is that the more intersects of oppression, the more the risk around traumatic impact. And so when you know across the lifespan that really right from birth, some of our youngest people are going to face great risk around traumatic experience, we need to be involved in those communities and with certain population groups pre them coming into the world, right? And really looking at what type of resourcing are we putting in place so people can know, what is the risk. How do we then get supports, and how do we have healthier families, healthier communities, and a healthier society? And that's before kids even get to school. Mm-hmm. The research is really, it's all over the place right now, but you're seeing numbers that are from 40% up to 80% of our young people will be bullied in the schools. And then we're also looking at our increase in online bullying, which is, so big that it's even hard to capture it all, because so much of it is just happening at home and kids are in it and facing it. So now we put on another level of traumatic experience. And then as you go into, of course, the emerging adult years, we know that our 16 to 24-year-olds are greatest at risk for sexual assaults and physical assaults and workplace harassment. And so that's from birth until 24. Mm-hmm. That's a very short period of time, and that's a very important period of time because it's our developmental years for our young people as they are developing into their adult selves, and the brain is still developing into that 24, 25, 26, and that number keeps moving around too. And so all of those primary years, the risk is at its greatest. And unfortunately, statistically speaking, all of that interpersonal violence within the family, it's actually the greatest risk around who's going to be the perpetrator of that violence is the parent or step-parent. And yet they're the greatest protective factor. When parents are well and they're strong and communities are supporting them, they're the greatest protective factor. But they're also the greatest risk factor if they're not doing as well. And so all those traumatic experiences are happening within some of the family systems that we hope that are there to protect our young people. And then we bring them into schools, and that's our next biggest protective factor, because you have all of these caring people educated that know what to look for around violence and how it might show up in children. And yet if we have 40 to 80% of our young people being bullied in the schools, that just is another big risk factor. And then we put them into their teen years and into their young adult years. So these are the years that we need to be most active in prevention. And I say prevention these days is intervention. Once you're in the intervention mode, the impact is already there and can be quite substantial. And you can't get yourself back to what was the normal that was before. There's impact that may not change in the way we hope. Right? But I do believe in resiliency, and I do believe in that really good psychological post-traumatic recovery that can happen. And we are doing a lot of great research, and we're looking at how to help people come through traumatic impact, and as they live with trauma, find ways to help them heal. And that is where I believe the hope is, but we can't just have hope. We have to have action. I think a lot of times we sit in thought around healing, and yet we have to determine it. We have to be active in it. And that's where we need to build in our resources, our responses. We have to have difficult conversations, and we have to have good research that helps us, right, find new pathways around trauma-focused care. And, whether that's medical, psychological, social work, sociological, epigenetics shows us that the genetics can be shaped out by risk and protective factors in the environment. And so we can always bring in protective factors that can help reduce impact, as long as we're willing to have some difficult conversations and recognize that impact is there, and make sure all voices are included in that. Otherwise, if we exclude voices around, what is trauma and what it means to them, it's just another level of being invalidated and leads to unsafeness and exclusionary practices, which is really another form of more of a covert violence if you're not included in the conversation, right?
Dr. Miller, the information that you've provided and your expertise, I greatly appreciate it. And I think a lot of people that are listening to this that are feeling very alone and with nobody to turn to are going to be able to reach out to potentially you in your clinic or people out there in resources to be able to get the help that they need and the support that they need. So with the last 2 minutes to spare, is there anything that you want to leave the viewers with, can you give a little bit of information about your clinic and some of the resources that you have to offer there, so when people do come to you, they know what to expect, or they know what to ask for or look out for?
Okay, so what I would like to start with is one of the things I have found in the research I'm doing, and this is for all people. So I am working on a piece of research right now looking at the role of self-determination in the healing of trauma. And what I've been finding, it's an interpretive analysis of qualitative research. What I've been finding is that people are saying a couple things. So this is a preview to my research that hasn't been published yet. They're saying that a person that hurt them mattered most. That sometimes it took years to tell their story. And that when someone actually made the time and validated that they had gone through something very difficult and had been very alone in it, right? And that now they were coming into a space to be heard and that they would no longer be alone in it, because with resources and support and to be heard, that was very powerful for them. So that's coming through in the research data right now, the lived experience data. The other thing that was coming through is in the role of self-determination, is that they could determine when they would go to therapy or when they would start to talk about it. And that's an interesting piece of information, because a lot of times we come in and we want people to talk about it, but trauma-focused care would say, let's let them know we're here. And yes, if they're young and there's, depending on the severity of whatever has impacted them, sometimes we do need to take them into some sort of medical care and some sort of psychological care. But for other folks, they want to know that you've heard them, and then they also want to have choice. Who do I see? When do I see them? When am I ready to tell the rest of my story? So those are important pieces I want to bring in from my research, because as I've been reading through the lived experience data and making sense of it, it's very powerful for people, one, to be heard, to know that they're not alone, and also to have choice. And then I think in relation to my clinic, I don't want to just focus on my clinic. I think our clinic offers some really good trauma-focused care, and from a space to talk, we also have a lot of room if people are looking at wanting to have some assessment work and they're really wanting to look at the impact on their mental health, and then also looking at longer-term trauma therapy. So we provide that, and also education in groups as well. But I think in this city, there are phenomenal resources that look at helping people. And we have not-for-profits. We have medical care that provides some really good trauma-informed practice. We have even some of the lay people in the communities you'll see in relation to faith communities. Peer support is out there. Educational institutions are doing a great job with making sure they have barrier-free access to students that at least want to sit down and talk to someone. And then I also want to remind people that if you see someone suffering and you think that maybe, just maybe, you want to just check in because something seems off, please do. Because that one conversation can make a difference in someone's life. They may not tell you everything, but just to know that they've been seen and that there is someone there thinking about them can be the beginning of someone thinking, you know what, I think it's time someone made a difference. It's like a very small something, but sometimes that validation of someone thinking about them in that moment does start that change process.
I love that. Thank you so much. I value your time.
You're
and
welcome.
Everything that you've shared. I could just sit here and listen to you, and you could just keep going and going, and I'm just like in awe, because the information is just so relevant right now. And in our world today, there's just so many distractions. There's a lot of factors that are causing people to kind of spiral in their own way and not know where to turn. So I think this conversation and what you had to say is very powerful and very needed. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for watching. Until next time.